So Princess Anne, apparently, marched into Buckingham Palace in the middle of the night, ripped the hard drive out of a server rack, and started an all-out war with Queen Camilla over an alleged plot to destroy Prince William's future. And the reason this story has people talking isn't just the drama of it. It's that the details, the timeline, and the sheer scale of what was supposedly going on are so specific that you have to wonder where the line between palace gossip and actual crisis is. Like, if even half of this is true, then the monarchy is dealing with a level of internal sabotage that makes the usual family squabbling look like a bake sale. Before we get into the weeds, do me a quick favor and hit subscribe on my channel so you don't miss updates on this mess. Okay, let's break it down. So, the core of the story is that Princess Anne, of all people, found a classified digital file on an encrypted server. And this wasn't a random discovery. She was doing a routine administrative audit, which already tells you something about how deeply involved she is in the operational side of the family. She's not just showing up for ribbon cuttings. She has access to the palace's internal network, and she used that access to find a hidden partition that was supposedly scrubbed during a digital migration back in 2020. The file was deliberately mislabeled as architectural blueprints to avoid detection. That's not something a random staffer would think to do. Whoever placed it there knew exactly how the IT architecture worked, which narrows the suspect pool to people with senior administrative knowledge. And according to the metadata, the upload stamp matched a period when the household was being restructured under the direct supervision of Camilla's private secretary. So, right away, the fingerprints point in one direction. Now, the contents of that file are where things get genuinely unsettling. And we're not talking about casual complaints or private gripes. The documents outline a structured long-term plan to marginalize Prince William's household, restrict his access to estate revenue, and curtail his administrative authority once he reached adulthood. The plan covered his military postings, his public funding, and his patronages. Every single point was designed to create friction between him and the center of the monarchy. When you actually look at what was said versus what happened over the years, the negative stories, the funding delays, the canceled meetings, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like a coordinated strategy. And that's the part that makes this so hard to dismiss. If this were just a few angry emails, you could chalk it up to office politics. But the file allegedly contained hundreds of internal memos, legal authorizations, and financial ledgers. That's not a grudge, that's an operation. Here's where the story gets weird. Anne found a subfolder protected by a secondary password. She tried her emergency code, and the system rejected it. The prompt asked for biometric authorization that only belonged to the current queen, and the final layer of that file had been locked down less than 12 hours before Anne accessed it. So, someone knew she was getting close, or they were locking things down preemptively. That timing doesn't add up unless someone inside the palace was actively monitoring the situation. Anne didn't wait around. She pulled the storage unit out of the rack, put it in her coat, and walked straight toward the king's private office. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a lamp and a single memo lying face down on the desk. That memo was dated for later that morning and ordered an immediate review of William's security detail under the pretext of budget restructuring. The signature wasn't the king's, it was Camilla's. So Anne grabs the memo, slams it down, and heads for the queen's private sitting room. The guards tried to stop her. She shoved past one and threatened the other's badge. When she got inside, the room was covered in open files, financial ledgers, and carbon copies of official stationery bearing the private seal of the Duchy of Cornwall. Camilla was running a parallel administrative hub right out of her living quarters. She had a shadow office. When Camilla walked out of the dressing room, she didn't look surprised. She looked calm. She poured hot water into a cup and told Anne she was confusing routine estate management with grand conspiracy. She suggested Anne had spent too much time in dusty archives, but Anne had the drive. She had the forged memo. She told Camilla the game was finished and the copies were secured outside the palace walls. Camilla's mask slipped for a second. Her eyes narrowed. She told Anne she was destroying the monarchy over personal grudge. That line is interesting because it's not a denial. It's a deflection. It's the kind of thing someone says when they know the evidence is real, but they're trying to reframe the argument around emotion instead of facts. So Anne goes back to her quarters, opens the subfolder, and finds detailed logistical breakdowns of William's schedule, public appearances, and private meetings over a 10-year span. They were labeled as risk assessments, but each one was designed to highlight alleged conflicts of interest between his charitable patronages and the commercial interests of the wider estate. The goal was to create a paper trail of administrative complaints that could justify stripping him of responsibilities. And attached to those reports were emails between senior palace administrators and external PR consultants discussing ways to leak negative stories about William's travel expenses to friendly tabloid reporters. The operation was funded through a discretionary account managed directly by Camilla's private office. The consultants had been given temporary passes without the standard background checks or non-disclosure agreements. Camilla had signed the authorization herself under an emergency clause reserved for matters of national security. She used her emergency powers to give corporate lobbyists and media fixers direct access to sensitive scheduling data about the heir to the throne. That's not just an internal family dispute, that's a national security breach. And the fact that she used a clause meant for genuine threats to the country to protect her own political maneuvering is the kind of contradiction that makes this story impossible to ignore. If there was nothing to hide, why misuse emergency powers? Why bypass the Home Office? Why route internal strategy documents through a secure server registered to a private legal firm in Geneva? That's not routine estate management. That's covering your tracks. Anne called William's private residence. His secretary answered. She told him to wake the prince immediately, that the house was compromised from the top down, and to refuse entry to any administrative staff carrying blue folders. That detail, blue folders, is oddly specific, and it suggests there was an internal system of identification for documents coming from Camilla's shadow office. Anne hung up, grabbed her coat, and headed back out. The courtiers were starting to wake up. Servants were carrying trays, guards were changing shifts. She walked past all of them with her head high. She had the truth in her pocket. Meanwhile, King Charles was sitting in his study with a cold cup of tea and a stack of letters he hadn't signed. He had delegated day-to-day management to Camilla during his medical treatments. He trusted her choices. He didn't look closely at the paperwork, and now that trust was his biggest liability. A footman delivered a brown envelope from the Home Office. Inside was an urgent request for clarification regarding the reallocation of security funds for William's household. The government had noticed an unauthorized drop in the operational budget assigned to the heir. They wanted to know if the reduction had been ordered by the sovereign or if an outside office had tampered with the ledger. So the plot had already leaked outside the palace walls. Government officials had spotted the financial irregularities. They were preparing for a parliamentary review. And on the back of that official letter was a handwritten note on pink stationery bearing Camilla's monogram. It advised Charles to sign a pre-written statement taking full personal responsibility for the budget shifts. The note said taking the blame himself was the only way to protect the unity of the crown. That's the moment the story shifts from palace intrigue to something much darker. Camilla wasn't just managing the household. She was managing the king. She expected him to fall on his sword for her corporate maneuvers without asking questions. She treated his reign as a shield for her own ambitions. Charles opened his desk drawer, pulled out the drive Anne had given him, placed it next to the pink note, and then drew a thick black line through Camilla's text. He crossed out her signature. He stood up, walked to the window, and realized he had to choose between his marriage and his crown. He called the captain of the guard and ordered a lockdown of the residential wing. No one in or out of the Queen's apartments until further notice. The House of Cards was coming down. Now William and Catherine were at their country residence reviewing the files Anne had transferred. They have an independent operational staff separate from Buckingham Palace, which saved them from being directly compromised. But their schedule and budgets had been targeted for months. Catherine had her own dossier collected by her office. The mystery was how the funds had been siphoned without triggering bank alarms. Every transfer of that scale required dual authorization from the chief accountant. The answer was that the accountant had been quietly promoted by Camilla's office 2 years earlier. He classified the transactions as emergency estate maintenance and used a loophole in the financial code to mask the movement of money. The funds hadn't vanished. They were routed through a shell company in London tied directly to the PR consultants leaking negative stories. So the plot against William was being financed using revenue from his own ancestral estate. That's a level of audacity that's hard to wrap your head around. Then William's phone buzzed. An unknown number sent a photograph of the front gates of their residence taken from the public road less than 5 minutes earlier. 2 unmarked cars were parked by the trees. They belonged to a private security firm hired by Camilla's office. Catherine didn't panic. She called their head of security, ordered the outer gate monitors deployed, and told them to detain anyone entering without a pass signed by the king himself. William wrote a note to the chief constable about unauthorized surveillance. He signed it. Catherine sealed it with wax. Then William called the king's direct line. He told him they were moving their team back to London to help clean the house. The counter-move had begun. Back at the press office, a junior clerk was staring at a stack of papers. He read the numbers in the margin, looked at the clock and realized it was nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. He called a private number. An editor at a major London newspaper answered. The clerk told him the audit documents were real, the names were accurate, and a complete backup of the dossier was in his secure inbox. The mystery was how the media got wind of the story before any formal announcement. The palace security team had monitored all outgoing communications for weeks, but the last file transfer had been sent using the private terminal of Camilla's own press secretary. She had copied the entire dossier and sent it to the press herself. She was trying to secure her future by turning whistleblower before the police arrived at her door. That's the thing about conspiracies. They rely on loyalty, and loyalty evaporates the moment people realize the ship is sinking. The dossier contained enough evidence to trigger a full parliamentary inquiry into the administration of the royal estate. The financial diversions, the forged signatures, the coordinated attacks on William were all documented with absolute clarity. The media prepared special morning editions. The government tried to halt the release pending a constitutional review, but it was too late. The clerk crumpled the memo, grabbed his jacket, and walked out. He didn't look back. By morning, the story was everywhere. The headlines were bold. The names were public. The quiet management of the royal household had become an open constitutional crisis. Ministers faced emergency parliamentary questions. The financial transfers, the security reviews, the forged decrees were out in the open. The government demanded a formal, transparent inquiry into the royal estates. The mystery of how Camilla's faction maintained secrecy for so long was answered by the personnel logs. It wasn't loyalty, it was fear. Anyone who questioned the directives was reassigned, demoted, or pushed out. The Queen's office had created a closed loop of absolute obedience. They simply miscalculated the determination of Princess Anne and the resilience of William and Catherine's household. Camilla was confined to her apartments. Her consultants vanished. Her private secretary resigned and left the country. The shadow administration she built over 2 decades was dismantled in less than 24 hours. She was alone, waiting for a verdict. The political analysts debated whether Charles would abdicate or whether Parliament would strip the royal household of its financial exemptions. The answers were no longer locked in a safe. They were being debated on live television. William and Catherine stood in their London study watching the broadcast. They didn't celebrate. They understood the gravity. Winning the internal battle meant inheriting the responsibility of rebuilding a broken house. Anne walked through her garden in Gloucestershire with a formal notification from the Privy Council, confirming receipt of the archive evidence. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She had protected the line of succession at a massive personal cost. The family would never be the same. Charles sat at his desk. The pick note was still in the wastebasket. He wrote a letter to the Prime Minister requesting a full independent audit of all royal accounts. He stated clearly that no member of the royal family would be exempt. He signed his name. The era of hidden influence and backroom manipulation was over. The monarchy had been brought to the brink by its own members. But in the ashes, a new reality took shape. The truth had won. The line of succession was secure. The house was being cleaned from the ground up. The public had seen behind the velvet curtain. They had witnessed the raw ambition and bitter rivalries beneath the pomp. The institution could no longer rely on mystery to command respect. It had to earn it through transparency and accountability, and that's the real implication here. This story, whether you take every detail literally or read it as a dramatized version of real tensions, exposes the fundamental fragility of an institution that depends on silence. The moment that silence breaks, the entire structure trembles. Princess Anne, the most no-nonsense member of that family, became the one to break it. And once that door was opened, there was no closing it again. The monarchy will survive, probably, but it will carry the scars of this chapter forever. The public saw too much. And once you see how the machine works, you can't unsee it. What makes this even more remarkable is the fact that Anne acted alone at first. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't convene a committee. She didn't wait for official clearance. She saw the evidence, understood what it meant, and moved. That decisiveness is rare in any institution, let alone one built on centuries of protocol and deference. In a household where every action is weighed against tradition and public perception, Anne behaved like someone who understood that delay was the real danger. Every hour that passed gave the Shadow Office more time to bury documents, pressure witnesses, and spin the narrative. She knew that the palace machine could absorb almost any scandal if it was given enough time to manage the fallout. So, she denied them that time. She forced the crisis into the open before the machinery of containment could kick in. That choice, more than anything else, is what turned this from an internal dispute into a genuine reckoning. And the fact that she was the one to do it is significant. Anne has spent decades cultivating a reputation for bluntness and duty. She doesn't chase headlines. She doesn't leak to the press. She shows up, does the work, and goes home. So, when someone like that decides to rip a hard drive out of a server rack at 2 o'clock in the morning, it carries a weight that no amount of tabloid speculation could ever match. It tells the public that this isn't a game. It tells the staff that the old rules no longer apply. And it tells the people at the center of the conspiracy that they have miscalculated in a way they cannot undo. There's also the question of what this means for the relationship between the king and his heir. Charles and William have never had an easy bond. The pressures of the institution, the legacy of Diana, the different temperaments, all of it has created distance. But this crisis forced them to communicate in ways they had avoided for years. They had to align their teams, coordinate their responses, and decide together how to handle the legal and political fallout. In a strange way, the conspiracy against William may have done what years of family counseling could not. It forced Charles to see in concrete terms what his delegation of authority had enabled. It forced William to see that his father, whatever his flaws, was not the architect of the campaign against him, and it forced both of them to confront the reality that the monarchy cannot function as a collection of rival households. It either operates as a single institution with clear lines of accountability, or it collapses under the weight of its own internal contradictions. For Catherine, this was a defining moment too. She has often been underestimated by the old guard, written off as a quiet figure in the background. But the way she handled the security threat at their residence, the calm she brought to the situation, the fact that she had already assembled her own dossier, all of it suggests that she was far more prepared than anyone realized. She didn't crumble under the pressure. She didn't defer to the palace's version of events. She acted, And in doing so, she showed that the next generation of the monarchy is not willing to be passive. They understand that the institution's survival depends on their willingness to fight for it. The long-term consequences are still unfolding. The parliamentary inquiry alone could take months, maybe longer. The financial audits will likely uncover more than anyone expects. And the public's appetite for royal drama has been sharpened to a point where every small development will be scrutinized. The days of quiet management behind closed doors are over. At least for now, the monarchy has been forced into a new era of visibility, whether it likes it or not. And the people who orchestrated the old system, the fixers, the consultants, the shadow administrators, are either gone or running for cover. What remains is an institution trying to rebuild itself in full view of the world. That is not a comfortable position for a family built on centuries of controlled image and managed secrecy, but it may be the only position that allows them to survive. So, when you look at the whole picture, the story of Anne and the hard drive is not just about one dramatic night, it's about the end of an era. It's about the moment when the palace's internal contradictions finally burst into the open, and it's about the people who decided against all instinct and training that the truth mattered more than the appearance of unity. The fallout will be felt for years. The monarchy will have to adapt or face consequences no one can fully predict. But one thing is certain, the machine has been exposed, the gears are visible, the public has seen how it works, and that knowledge changes everything.